The one they called the Shadow. The new nurse who moves through hallways without speaking, who wrote notes in the margins of charts no one bothered to read, was already running toward the screaming before the charge nurse had even registered that something was wrong. That's the part nobody talks about afterward. How fast she moved. Pemberton General wasn't the kind of hospital that made the news for good reasons. It sat on the western edge of Sudbury, Ontario, sandwiched between a shuttered auto parts plant and a Tim Hortons that had been there since 1987. The emergency department smelled like floor wax and old coffee and something underneath both that nobody could name. The fluorescent lights in Bay 4 had been flickering since March. Nobody had fixed them. Nurse Caitlin Marsh had been there for 11 days. She had come from nowhere as far as the senior staff were concerned. No references that anyone had actually called. A résumé that listed a decade of employment in places most of the charge nurses couldn't find on a map. Kandahar, Kabul, a forward operating base outside Helmand province with a name that was just a series of letters and numbers. Dr. Hayes, Everett, the head of emergency medicine, had looked at that résumé for approximately 4 seconds before setting it face down on his desk. She's a probationary hire, he told charge nurse Lacey Drummond on Marsh's first morning. Treat her accordingly. Drummond had taken that to mean keep her away from anything important. So for 11 days, Caitlin Marsh stocked supply carts. She restocked supply carts. She filed paperwork that could have been filed by anyone with a working hand in basic literacy. When she finished, she stood quietly at the nurse's station and watched. And that watching, that silent, unblinking attention, was what bothered Drummond most. She just stares, Drummond told the other nurses during the 6 a.m. handoff on a Tuesday in November, like she's waiting for something. Nobody asked what. Marsh herself didn't explain. She arrived at 6:45 every morning, 15 minutes before her shift, changed in the locker room without speaking to anyone, and appeared at the station like she'd materialized from the walls. She was 32, maybe 33. It was hard to tell. Her face was the kind that had been weathered into stillness. Not pretty in the way the hospital corridors rewarded. Not loud, not warm in the immediately readable way that made patients reach for your hand. She had brown hair that she kept in a low bun, and she wore her scrubs like she'd been wearing uniforms her whole life. Which, as it turned out, she had. The other nurses had settled into a comfortable consensus about her within the first week. She was a flight risk, probably burned out somewhere else, drifting. Probably couldn't handle real pressure. Probably fine for supply carts. Dr. Kieran Whitfield, the second-year resident who'd been given the dubious honor of supervising probationary staff that month, had tried once to assign her to a trauma intake. Drummond had stopped him in the hallway. She's not cleared for critical patients, Drummond said. She has a nursing license, Whitfield said. She's probationary. Whitfield had let it go. He was 28 and still learning which hills were worth dying on in this particular hospital. Marsh had said nothing when the assignment was quietly redirected. She went back to the supply cart. She noted, without reacting, that the defibrillator in Bay 6 had a fraying cord that maintenance had tagged and then apparently forgotten. She noted that the oxygen line in the waiting area ran alongside a heating duct in a way that made her faintly uneasy. She noted that the security guard at the main entrance, a heavy-set man named Bertrand, who everyone liked, left his post at 10:15 every morning to get coffee, and that during those 7 minutes the entrance was unmonitored. She noted all of this, the way she had been trained to note things. Quietly, without expression, filing it away. On the morning of November 14th, 7 minutes after Bertrand left for his coffee, a man walked through the main entrance of Pemberton General carrying a backpack. The first thing Marsh registered was the gate. She was at the supply cart near the end of the main corridor, 30 feet from the entrance, replacing saline bags. She didn't look up immediately. She didn't need to. She heard the automatic doors, heard the footsteps on the tile, and something in the rhythm of those footsteps, the particular weight distribution, the slight forward lean, the way the left foot struck harder than the right, pulled her attention the way a wrong note pulls the ear. She looked up. The man was mid-40s, wearing a gray jacket over a blue hoodie, a backpack on both shoulders. He was looking at the directory board near the entrance. He was doing what people do when they want to appear to be doing something. Marsh set down the saline bag. She had spent 4 years as a combat medic with the Canadian Forces, deployed twice to Afghanistan. She had spent 2 years after that working with a civilian demining organization operating in post-conflict zones in West Africa. She had, in the language of the debrief forms she'd filled out more times than she could count, been in contact with explosive devices on 19 separate occasions. She had helped build them once, under supervision, for training purposes, which meant she understood intimately what a person carrying one looked like from the outside. They looked like this. She walked toward the nurse's station at the same pace she always walked, unhurried, even, and picked up the desk phone and called security. Then she set the phone down and walked back toward the entrance. Later, people would ask why she didn't wait for security. Later, people would ask a lot of things that assumed waiting was an option. The man had moved away from the directory board. He was walking toward the corridor that led to the imaging department, where, at 10:22 on a Tuesday morning, there were 11 patients in waiting chairs. Marsh followed. "Sir." He didn't stop. "Sir, I need you to wait here for a moment." He turned then, and she saw his eyes do what eyes did in that particular kind of situation. A rapid calculation, a measuring of distance. And she moved her body to block the corridor in a way that was not aggressive, not obviously tactical. That looked to anyone watching like a nurse stepping into someone's path by mild accident. "The imaging department is full right now," she said. "We're asking visitors to wait in the main area." She smiled. It was not a warm smile, but it was a smile. "Can I see your visitor pass?" He didn't have one. "Let me get you sorted out at the front desk," she said. "It'll just take a minute." He hesitated. The hesitation was enough. The security door at the end of the corridor opened, and 2 guards came through. Bertrand, back from his coffee with the radio in his hand, and the younger guard whose name Marsh had never learned. And the man in the gray jacket looked at them and looked at Marsh and made a decision that, in retrospect, was the best decision he made that morning. He sat down on the bench beside the water fountain. The backpack, when the bomb disposal unit from Greater Sudbury Police opened it 45 minutes later, in the parking lot far from the building, contained what the officer in charge described to Drummond as a functional device. He said it twice, as if the repetition would help her understand what she was hearing. Drummond was at the nurse's station when the officer said this. Marsh was charting at the desk beside her, catching up on the morning's paperwork, which she had fallen behind on during the disruption. Drummond looked at her for a long moment. "Were you frightened?" she asked. Marsh kept writing. "I had a job to do." "But it's the same job," Marsh said. "The location changes. The job doesn't." The hospital administrator, a thin man named Gerald Featherstone, who wore the same shade of gray in his suits that he wore in his face, called Marsh into his office at 2 in the afternoon. He thanked her. He used the word impressive 3 times. He mentioned, carefully, that her quick response had likely prevented significant casualties, and that the hospital's board would be very pleased, and that he was sure there would be. He paused here, selecting his words like a man choosing produce. Appropriate recognition of her contribution. Marsh sat with her hands in her lap and waited for him to finish. "You should know," Featherstone said, "that this kind of initiative, outside your immediate scope, it's the sort of thing that could raise concerns about probationary staff exceeding their station," Marsh said. He adjusted his tie. "I wouldn't have put it that way. How would you have put it?" He didn't answer. Marsh thanked him for his time and left. In the hallway, she passed Dr. Everett, who was walking in the opposite direction with a coffee mug and a tablet. He stopped. He looked at her the way people looked at things they had badly miscalculated. "Marsh," he said. "Dr. Everett." A pause. "That was well done. Thank you." She kept walking. She was halfway to the locker room before Whitfield fell into step beside her, slightly out of breath, like he'd been waiting and had almost missed her. "I heard what happened," he said. "Most people have. I heard you identified him before security even knew he was in the building." "I saw something that didn't fit," Marsh said. It's pattern recognition. It's not complicated. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then, can I ask? Your file. The deployment history. Afghanistan. The demining work. You left all of that and came here. To Sudbury. To supply carts. Marsh pushed the locker room door open and held it with one hand. She looked at him directly, which was something she didn't often do. I came here because I wanted to do medicine, she said. I spent 10 years keeping people alive long enough to get them somewhere they could actually be healed. I wanted to be the somewhere. She let the door go. The supply carts are fine. I can see what's happening from the supply carts. The door swung shut behind her. She was back the next morning at 6:45. She changed in the locker room. She appeared at the station. Drummond was already there, and for a moment the two women looked at each other, and Drummond had the particular expression of someone revising a story they had told confidently and too many times. Bay 3 needs restocking, Drummond said finally. I'll do that, said Marsh. She picked up the inventory clipboard and walked down the corridor. The lights in Bay 4 were still flickering. She made a note to report it again. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, a Thursday, the hospital received a call from the Greater Sudbury Police Department. The detective on the case, a woman named Daisy Winters, compact and meticulous, who had the manner of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible story, came to the hospital to follow up. She met with Marsh in one of the consultation rooms near the emergency department. Detective Winters had Marsh's file on the table between them, though she didn't open it. She looked at Marsh, and then looked at the file, and then looked at Marsh again. You've read the preliminary report, Winters said. I haven't, Marsh said. No one shared it with me. The device was intended for the oncology ward, Winters said. Specifically the infusion suite on the 3rd floor. We believe it was connected to a grievance. Personal loss, a family member who died there 6 months ago. She paused. This is the parts where I tell you that the man you stopped yesterday was not working alone. Marsh said nothing. We have reason to believe a second individual is targeting this facility, Winters said. Possibly today. Possibly already inside. The consultation room was very quiet. Outside, through the single narrow window, Marsh could see a stretch of parking lot and beyond it the white sky of northern Ontario, November. What do you need from me? Marsh said. Your eyes, said Winters. You caught what our cameras missed. Our threat assessment team wants to know what you saw and how you saw it. And then, Winters hesitated, which was not something she appeared to do often. We'd like you to walk the building. Now, if you're willing. Marsh stood. Let me get my badge. They walked the hospital for 40 minutes, Marsh and Winters, with 2 plainclothes officers trailing at a distance that would have been invisible to most people, and was therefore visible to Marsh immediately, though she didn't comment on it. She walked the way she always walked, that same unhurried pace, and she talked quietly and continuously, pointing out things with the smallest possible gestures. The way you learn to point in places where pointing drew fire. The heating duct beside the oxygen line, the service entrance on the east side where the badge reader had a 3-second lag, the blind corner near radiology where the camera coverage had a gap approximately 6 feet wide. Winters took notes on her phone. You see all of this every day, she said. I see everything every day, Marsh said. That's different from noticing. At 1:37 in the afternoon, in the hospital's lower level, outside the door to the facilities management office, Marsh stopped walking. There was a woman in the corridor. She was wearing a maintenance uniform, Pemberton General's navy blue, and she was standing beside a wheeled cart of the kind used for carrying cleaning supplies. She was looking at her phone. The cart had more weight in it than cleaning supplies weighed. Marsh could tell this by the way the wheels were sitting on the tile. She turned to Winters and said, very quietly, without moving her lips much, the way she had learned to say things in places where being overheard had consequences. She's not maintenance. The cart. Winters looked at her phone and typed something. 10 seconds later, the 2 plainclothes officers appeared at either end of the corridor. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes. Later, it would be described in the police report with the bloodless precision of official documentation. The individual was identified, approached, and detained without incident. The cart was secured. The scene was cleared. What the report did not describe was the moment in the middle of those 4 minutes when the woman looked at Marsh, not at the officers, not at Winters, but directly at Marsh, with an expression that Marsh had seen before, in other places, that particular amalgam of desperation and calculation, and something underneath both that was probably grief. Marsh held the woman's gaze. She didn't look away. "I know," she said, quietly enough that only the woman could hear. "I know something happened to someone you loved. That's real. What you're doing with it is going to destroy everything else." The woman's face changed. She sat down on the floor beside the cart. The officers reached her 15 seconds later. By 4 o'clock, the building had been cleared, and the second device had been rendered safe, and the news vans were parked at the edge of the hospital's property, their satellite equipment pointing at the sky. Featherstone called another meeting. This one included the hospital board chair, a woman named Dr. Gloria Pemberton. Yes, that Pemberton, the family for whom the hospital was named, and 2 people from the Provincial Health Authority who had driven up from Toronto and still had that particular windshield squint of people who had made an unexpected long journey. Marsh sat at the end of the table. They thanked her again. There were, this time, more words. Several more. The board chair mentioned that the hospital was committed to recognizing exceptional contributions. The provincial people mentioned something about formal commendation. Featherstone mentioned, as if the thought had just arrived to him organically, that the question of Marsh's probationary status was perhaps something that merited expedited review. Marsh listened to all of this. Then she said, "There's a fraying cord on the defibrillator in Bay 6. It was tagged by maintenance in early September. I've submitted 2 written requests for replacement and they haven't been actioned. I'd like that fixed before the end of the week." There was a pause around the table. "Also," Marsh said, "the lighting in Bay 4, the flickering, causes visual disruption during assessments. That needs to be addressed." Dr. Pemberton looked at her for a long moment. She was a woman in her 60s with the kind of face that had made 100 important decisions and knew it. "Is that everything?" she said. "That's the most urgent," Marsh said. "I have a longer list." Something shifted in Dr. Pemberton's expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I'd like to see it," she said. The cord on the defibrillator in Bay 6 was replaced on Friday. The lights in Bay 4 were fixed on Saturday morning by a maintenance technician who arrived at 7 and was done by 8, and who, when Marsh thanked him, looked at her like no one had ever thanked him for fixing a light before. On Monday, Drummond was at the station when Marsh arrived at 6:45. "Whitfield wants you on trauma intake today," Drummond said without looking up from her clipboard. "All right," said Marsh. A pause. Then, still not looking up, "The supply cart in Bay 3 is actually done. From last week. You don't need to worry about it." "I restocked it this morning," Marsh said, "before you arrived." Drummond looked up. Marsh had already turned down the corridor toward Bay 1. She passed the defibrillator in Bay 6 on her way. The new cord was neatly coiled, properly secured. She registered it the same way she registered everything, without stopping, without ceremony, and kept walking. The emergency department doors opened at the end of the hall, and the first patient of the morning came through, and Caitlin Marsh, who had been a combat medic in 2 countries and a demining specialist in 3 more, and was now, at last, exactly where she had meant to be, went to meet them.